28th of October 2017. By the time cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease manifest, PET scans reveal rampant amyloid throughout the brain. A new study tracks the regional progression of this hallmark pathology from beginning to end. In the October 18 Neurology, researchers led by Michel Groth of the German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases in Rostock report that they have developed a four-stage model of regional A-beta deposition. Drawing on imaging data from nearly 700 volunteers in the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative (ADNI), they determined that the spatial distribution of A-beta plaques changed in a consistent manner as disease progressed, first appearing in the basal part of the temporal lobe, the anterior cingulate gyrus, and the bottom of the parietal lobe, then sweeping throughout the neocortex and eventually inward, overtaking subcortical regions such as the striatum. Floor-Batapia PET reveals a four-stage model of regional amyloid deposition. Scans from 98% of people along the AD spectrum fit the scheme. Stages correlated with CSF A-beta 42, clinical disease stage, and memory scores. The pattern aligns remarkably well with findings from post-mortem neuropathological studies. PET scans from 98% of volunteers with detectable A-beta fit along the staging spectrum. Notably, regional staging detected A-beta accumulation in many cognitively normal people who would have been considered amyloid negative using commonly applied global PET tracer thresholds. This study opens exciting new avenues for future research, and further points to the pressing question of what it means to have amyloid in the brain, especially in the earliest stages of A-beta accumulation, wrote Gail Chet-Elliott of the University of Caen Normandy in France and Melissa Murray of the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida, in an accompanying editorial. They added that longitudinal data will be crucial to validate the staging model. Using post-mortem neuropathology, researchers previously established that A-beta pathology spreads throughout the brain in a characteristic pattern. 15 years ago, Dietmar Thal, then at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, examined nearly 50 brains to derive 5 stages of A-beta deposition, moving from the neocortex to allocortex, and eventually inward to the brainstem and cerebellum. Thal et al. 2002. People in the earlier stages tended to be cognitively normal when they died, while those in later stages were likely to have been clinically diagnosed with AD. Among cognitively normal people, the frequencies of A-beta positivity, ranging from 0 blue-black to 55% red, were calculated for each of 52 brain regions left, shown in 3 cross-sectional views. This continuum of regional frequencies was then equally partitioned into 4 stages right. Courtesy of Groth et al., Neurology, 2017. Such a regional staging scheme has not yet been recapitulated using imaging, however. For practical purposes, an amyloid PET scan is considered positive if the global cortical standard uptake value ratio (SUVR), typically in comparison to uptake in the cerebellum, breaches a predefined threshold, usually 1.17. By the time cognitive symptoms manifest, most people have already been A-beta positive by this global measure for some time. On the flip side, cognitively normal people with positive scans often have inklings of memory problems. Jack et al. 2010, Bennett et al. 2012. Groth and colleagues set out to develop a regional A-beta staging scheme based on Floor-Batapia PET scans. They hypothesized that distinct changes in the distribution of A-beta would correlate with disease progression. Because most A-beta deposits before cognitive symptoms emerge, the researchers used PET scans from 179 cognitively normal people in the ADNI cohort. For each of 52 brain regions, the researchers calculated the percentage of cognitively normal participants who had an SUVR greater than 1.17. Next, they used the frequency of A-beta positivity as an indicator of regional progression, with the most frequently affected areas being indicative of earliest stage and least frequently positive areas being stage 4. This staging method, commonly used in neuropathology, assumes that as a pathological burden increases, the number of people surviving with that burden or, in this case, having no cognitive symptoms at the time of their scan, decreases. They found that roughly half of the cognitively normal people had A-beta deposition in various regions of the neocortex, including the basal part of the temporal lobe, the anterior cingulate, and the parietal operculum, an inner region of the parietal cortex that covers the insular cortex. Broader regions of the temporal, frontal, and parietal lobes harbored A-beta plaques in 30 to 40% of volunteers, while only about 15 to 25% had deposits in the sensory motor cortices and anterior lobe structures. Finally, only 5 to 10% accumulated A-beta in the striatum. The researchers then grouped brain regions by highest to lowest frequency of A-beta positivity into 4 anatomic divisions, which they proposed would correlate with stages of progression of A-beta pathology. These stages coincided with those developed independently from 1,000 other neuropathology studies. Amyloid stages. Regional progression of A-beta deposition, as proposed by the 4-stage model. Each progressive stage includes new affected regions red as well as affected regions from the previous stage blue. Courtesy of Groth al. Neurology, 2017. To validate their model, the researchers attempted to fit a broader set of scans into their staging scheme. From 667 ADNI volunteers who had diagnoses ranging from normal to AD, 418 had evidence of A-beta accumulation, and 410 of those 98% had regional deposition patterns that fit squarely into one of the 4 stages. The striking inclusivity of the model surprised Groth, especially given that it was generated without making any a priori assumptions of regional progression patterns. Michael Donohue of the University of Southern California in San Diego told ALS Forum that he was also surprised by how few participants failed to conform to the staging model. How would this 4-stage model compare to the dichotomous global SUVR cutoff tests for amyloid? The researchers found that all stage 4 and most stage 3 participants tested positive by global PET. However, about half of stage 2 and the vast majority of stage 1 tested negative. Even after reducing the global threshold from 1.17 to 1.10, 25% of stage 2 and 81% of stage 1 volunteers tested negative. The findings suggest that regional staging catches people in earlier stages of amyloidosis than the standard global test does. However, Groth pointed out that the clinical significance of these early stages is still unclear. The researchers next compared the concentration of cerebrospinal fluid A-beta 42 with the regional A-beta stages, and found that CSF A-beta 42 dropped continuously across progressive amyloid stages, with even stage 1 having lower concentrations than people without evidence of A-beta deposition, who were considered stage 0. This suggests that early regional deposition, which would have been missed via global measures, correlates with other biomarkers and has physiological meaning, Groth said. Henrik Zetterberg of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden was fascinated by the finding that A-beta deposition in quite restricted brain regions was sufficient to have an impact on lumbar CSF A-beta concentrations. He added that this could explain why among cognitively normal people and some with MCI, global amyloid PET scans come up negative while CSF A-beta tests are positive. The regional A-beta stages also correlated with clinical diagnosis. 96% of patients with Alzheimer's dementia fell into stage 3 or IV, compared with 66% of people with MCI and 42% of cognitively normal volunteers. Higher amyloid stages correlated with poorer performance on memory tests, but only for cognitively normal people are those with MCI, not AD, who scored lowest in these tests. In contrast, testing positive for global A-beta correlated with worse memory scores in the MCI and AD groups, but not in cognitively normal people. Together, these findings suggest that the regional A-beta staging scheme correlates with the severity of early cognitive symptoms, while the global measures correlate only with more severe cognitive decline in later clinical stages of disease. The staging suggests the possibility of a more inclusive and/or sensitive approach to screening for clinical trials in preclinical prodromal populations, Donohue wrote. As part of the validation, it will be interesting to examine disease progression for individuals identified as stage 1 or 2 but not reaching conventional global SUVR thresholds. Clinical trials that use global amyloid positivity by PET as an inclusion criterion could be excluding people with sub-threshold scans, even though they are in fact depositing considerable brain amyloid and are on the path to AD. Groth emphasized that the clinical significance of early-stage A-beta deposition remains unclear. The current definition of preclinical AD, a positive global A-beta scan in the absence of cognitive impairment, already includes about 20% of people over 70, Groth said. Including people who fall into amyloid stage 1 or 2 of the regional scheme could bump that number up to 40 to 50%. Interestingly, while high, this number aligns more closely with post-mortem neuropathological findings, which have found around half of cognitively normal elderly adults harbor A-beta deposits. Groth acknowledged the possibility that this early regional deposition could, in theory, reflect a benign aging process. Longitudinal data will show how fast people in early stages progress to later stages and clinical symptoms, he said. This makes using regional measures for clinical trial selection a dicey undertaking for now. The researchers plan to incorporate longitudinal data into the scheme. Recent longitudinal data from ADNI and the Australian Imaging, Biomarkers, and Lifestyle Study have reported that A-beta positivity predicted eventual cognitive decline, at least when global A-beta PET or CSF A-beta 42 were used. June 2017 News 18 al. 2017 Harrington al. 2017. Groth will also assess how various risk factors, including cardiovascular health, diet, and exercise, influence the rate of progression. Groth added that if validated, regional amyloid staging could be used in combination with tau PET scans, which have been developed with regional staging in mind from the get-go. He wondered whether stage 3 of A-beta deposition would be sufficient to drive tau out of the temporal lobe, as has been demonstrated for global A-beta measures. Jessica Shugart-Tull drive, RUB-U, ORANT-SEM, BRAC-H phases of A-beta deposition in the human brain and its relevance for the development of AD. Neurology. 2002 John 2,558,121,791,800. PubMed. Jack C.R., Notman D.S., Jagus W.J., Shaw L.M., Eisen P.S., Wiener M.W., Peterson R.C., Trojanowski J.Q. Hypothetical model of dynamic biomarkers of the Alzheimer's pathological cascade. Lancet Neurol. 2010 Jan 9,111,928. PubMed. Bennett D.A., Wilson R.S., Boyle P.A., Buckman S., Schneider Yar. Relation of neuropathology to cognition in persons without cognitive impairment. And Neurol. 2012 October 724,599,609. PubMed. Aiton S., Fazlol I.E.A., Bergi P., Raniga P., Ing A., Lim Y.Y., Jufai, Farquharson S., Fripp J., Ames D., Doki J., Desmond P., Audija, Masters C.L., Bro C.C., Marif P., Guillemane V.L., Australian Imaging Biomarkers and Lifestyle AIBL Research Group, Silvado O., Bush A.I. Cerebral quantitative susceptibility mapping predicts amyloid beta-related cognitive decline. Brain. 2017 August 1,140,821,122,119. PubMed. Harrington K.D., Lim Y.Y., Ames D., Hassan Stab J., Laws S.M., Martins R.N., Rainey Smith S., Robertson J., Rowe. C.C., Silvado O., Dore V., Guillemane V.L., Snyder P.J., Masters C.L., Marif P. Amyloid beta-associated cognitive decline in the absence of clinical disease progression and systemic illness. Alzheimer's dementia MST, 20,178,156,164. EPUB 2017 June 9 PubMed. Facebook Twitter LinkedIn RSS.